Hello from Training for Change. In this video, we will cover what is a spectrogram, why use a spectrogram, how do you make a spectrogram, and 10 different spectrograms for online. So first of all, what is a spectrogram? At its most basic, a spectrogram is when you have people place themselves along a spectrum. Instead of asking a yes or no question, you ask people where they fall along a range. For example, how long have you been living in this community? Place yourself along the spectrum from 0 years to 40 or more years. In person, you can invite people to stand up and move themselves to a place on the spectrum, like in this photo. So why would you use a spectrogram? When facilitating groups, whether in a training or a meeting, you can use a spectrogram in many ways. You can use a spectrogram to help people get to know each other and build a container that builds the capacity of what the group can talk about. You can use it to check for a range of agreement or alignment. Is the group close to agreement? Are they polarized? You can use it to check for a range of emotions. For example, how are people feeling after the last activity that you did? You can use it to read a group and to help a group see itself. For example, a spectrum can help you see if a group is ready to move forward. You can use it to read individual people and to help the group see where individuals are. You can use it to show nuances of a topic when it may be getting oversimplified. You can also use it to help the group with any of the above so that you can start a conversation or even find a starting point for a conversation. It can also help you make decisions about your process in the moment. Is it time to move on? Is there something that needs to be discussed? Or is it time for a break? We'll show some examples of different uses of spectrograms in the rest of this video. So we know you can use spectrograms in your in-person meetings by having people move around a room. But more and more often we're meeting and training online. So what about in our online spaces? Yes, you can also do spectrograms with groups online. That's what this is all about. When using spectrograms online, a visual way to represent your spectrum can help a lot. So how do you make a spectrogram for online? You can make a spectrum on a slide using a line or arrow tool. It works a little differently in different software. In Google Slides, it works like this. First, you choose the line tool and draw a line. Then you can add an arrow to either end of the line. You can change the line width and the line color. Then add a label to either end of the spectrum using the text tool. And add a question to the top of the spectrum. Now let's look at 10 different ways you can do spectrograms online and what each option is useful for. For the most basic spectrogram, tell people what two ends of a spectrum are and ask each person to share out loud where they are. For example, on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being very tired and 5 being you have lots of energy, where are you today? This share out loud spectrogram method is good for getting started with using simple spectrograms. It's good for phone meetings because visuals are optional. It's also good for when you decide in the moment that you want to add a spectrum to your meeting or training. Very similar to the first method, you can tell people two ends of a spectrum and invite them to share in the chat box in your online space. You can ask them to share just a number of where they are in the spectrum or a number and a bit about why they chose that number. You can then summarize out loud what you're seeing in the chat box or ask people follow-up questions about what they shared to get a conversation started. This method where you have people share in the chat box is good for hearing from a lot of people quickly. It helps you get a quick read of a group or engage a very large group when you wouldn't have time to hear from every single person. Whether having people share out loud or in the chat box, or giving them the option of either, you can add another layer by marking on screen what people are sharing. One easy way to do this is to show your slides, whatever software you're using, in edit mode on screen share, and edit the slide by dragging and dropping a shape onto the spectrum for each person like this. This method is good for when it's helpful for the group to be able to visualize where they are, for example, on a decision. It's also helpful because it gives you a record you can return to after the meeting or training to share with people who weren't present. Instead of the facilitator moving a shape for each person, you can let people move themselves. There are a couple ways to do this. The first way is to use a live collaborative document, like these Google Slides, and invite people into the document to edit it directly. In Google Slides, I would do this by changing the share settings to anyone with the link can edit, copying the link, and sharing it in the chat box in my online meeting. When people click the link, they can go into the document and edit directly. If I use the settings like I've shown here, instead of sharing the document with people's email addresses, participants will be anonymous in the document. If anyone has trouble or can't access the link, they can give you their number and you can move the shape for them. Having participants mark with shapes themselves is a good method for when you want to read a group and it feels like people being able to share anonymously might help. For example, if you think there's a conflict under the surface that you want to bring out, but you think people might be afraid to share about it. This is also a much faster way to map a group than having the facilitator move all the shapes. If the same group does this regularly in their meetings, you can get very fast at doing a spectrum together like this. A second option for this same method is to use the whiteboard or annotation feature that comes with a lot of web conferencing software. In this case, participants mark themselves with a scribble or a stamp. Different software has different options. For example, in Zoom, it could look like this, where people choose the stamp tool and mark where they are on the spectrum. Depending on your software, having participants mark using annotation can be much easier for participants than having to drag and drop in something like Google Slides. It's helpful for participants to not have to leave the meeting software to do an activity. It also allows you to use any software you want to make and share your slides, and you don't have to share your slides documents with participants. Remember to take a screenshot or save the whiteboard notes for the group's record before you move on. Instead of having people move a shape onto the spectrum, you can invite them to move their name or a picture of themselves to where they are on the spectrum. You can add names for them or let them type in their own names. Again, if someone's having trouble, you can have them share out loud or in the chat box and move the shape for them. Having participants mark with their names has the same benefits of having people move shapes, but it's good for when it's helpful to see where individuals are, rather than just mapping the whole group. It's also helpful for when anonymity is not important, or if anonymity might even be unhelpful. Just like with having people move shapes, you can also use a whiteboard or annotation feature on your web conferencing software if that's an option. Instead of drawing, participants can use the text tool to type their name on the spectrum like this. So for example, in Zoom, they would click the text annotation tool and type their name. Another variation is to not just have people add themselves to the spectrum once, but allow them to move themselves as their opinion changes during a discussion, like this. Having participants move themselves over time is good for a situation where you want to move a group through a sticky issue or decision, and tracking what changes people's position is helpful. For example, in this scenario, you can use the spectrum to identify where there's more clarity needed and open questions and discussion. As people move themselves toward clarity, you can see when the group is ready to move on to making a decision on the proposal. You can also have more than one spectrum on a slide. Labeling the different spectrums with letters like A, B, and C makes it easier for anyone to share in the chat box or out loud if needed. Having more than one spectrum is good for getting lots of information quickly. It's useful for evaluation and especially goes well with letting people answer on their own anonymously. You can also have a spectrum with more than one axis, like this. When someone places a mark, they're marking on two different spectrums at once. For example, in this case, someone might mark that they're very comfortable using a particular tactic, but that they think that that tactic is not very strategic. Having a two-axis spectrum is helpful for getting a deeper read or exploring more complex topics or relationships. You can use the same basics and variations you use for spectrograms for other activities, including things you can do online even more easily than you can in person. Here are a couple examples to get your creativity going. Instead of choosing a place on a spectrum, you can ask people to choose among numbered pictures. For example, using weather pictures to check on how people are feeling after a tough conversation. Instead of moving along a spectrum, you can have people move themselves inside another shape or diagram, like this. In summary, spectrograms are very useful. You can do spectrograms online. You can do spectrograms with any software, even just over the phone. There are many different options for doing spectrograms online with different benefits and drawbacks. And you can absolutely get creative with your spectrograms online. Thank you for watching. For more, check out trainingforchange.org.